Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live stream. This is a live podcast interview we do every Tuesday at the same time, same place, same platforms that you're watching or listening today. We do this every Tuesday. We cover digital transformation related topics. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And today's podcast topic is mastering project governance in digital transformations and ERP implementations. We're going to talk about project governance, what it is, how to get the right controls in place and the right methodologies in place to ensure that your digital transformation is successful. So that's the topic we'll cover here today. I'll introduce my guest who's going to help us unpack that topic here in just a moment. But before I introduce him, a couple logistical things. First of all, this podcast is part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast. So we do these live interviews every Tuesday, and then we edit it, we add more content to it, and we make it part of our formal, polished episode of Transformation Ground Control. And that podcast is released every Wednesday. We put out new episodes. So if you go to transformationgroundcontrol.com, you can see all the past episodes we've done, and you will see this episode appear in about 2 weeks on that website. You can also subscribe to the podcast at any of on whatever platform you prefer by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can do subscribe to the video version and or the audio podcast version. Also, we are going to take audience questions today. So I've got a list of questions I'm going to start with our guest, but really this is about you and making sure that we get the right audience involvement and cover the things that you want to cover here today. So be sure to drop in the chat any questions you might have. And speaking of the chat, we are going to get into the chat right now, actually, and we're keeping an eye on the chat. If you don't mind just dropping in the feed whatever city and country you're joining from today. We tend to draw a global audience, so it's always fun to see where everyone's joining from today. So if you don't mind just dropping the chat where you're watching or listening, just drop in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. I'm joining from Denver, Colorado in the U.S., I'll be curious to hear where you all are joining as well. So again, today's topic, mastering project governance in digital transformation and ERP implementations. And joining me to cover this topic is Nate Stroeher from Third Stage Consulting. Nate, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Eric. Excited to talk about this today.
Yeah, it's been a while since you've been on the podcast, so it's great to have you back. And I don't think we've covered this exact topic before, so it'll be great to chat with you about some of your client experiences. But before we jump into that, the client experience and sort of this whole concept of project controls and governance, tell us a little bit about your background and your role at Third Stage.
So I'm the practice lead at Third Stage, and my role is to make sure that we are doing the best job we can to make our product that we present to the client as uniform and as quality and as standard as possible, to make sure that we're giving the client exactly what we've promised we would deliver them from the first time we spoke to them all the way through to the final deliverable that we present to them. So as my role at practice lead, I'm in charge of putting together the tools that our teams use and the methodologies that our teams follow throughout these projects to ensure that we're giving you the best quality product that we can throughout the life cycle of the project.
Gotcha. And how about your background leading up to your role here at Third Stage? You've got a pretty interesting background leading up to this. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I've been in consulting for just about a little over 25 years. Started with Deloitte Consulting out of grad school. Have a background in digital transformation and change management, and also a lot of work around the finance transformation field. So really have focused a lot on both the technology side of it and the change management side of it. Obviously, working for a Big Four consulting firm at the beginning of my career was exposed and became very comfortable with very set methodologies, very set ways of doing things. So where my experience has been valuable and where I can add a lot to Third Stage Consulting and to our engagements is that mindset of trying to make everything that we do as uniform as possible and to give our employees and our partners the best tools that they can use to present to the clients and to really give the clients the best product that we can.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. It's an important and underrated role, in my opinion. So that's why it's fun to chat about this with you here today. But for those that may not know, maybe there's some people listening right now that are not project manager types. Maybe they're not PMP certified, or maybe they don't have sort of your traditional project management training or background. Help us understand, just when we talk about the word project governance, what does that mean, and why is it so important to keeping a digital transformation on track?
Well, really, and I kind of break project governance down into about 6 to 7 different areas, but it's really at a very high level. It's putting the guidelines and the controls and the methodology and the framework in place that allows a project, or I'm going to use project and a program interchangeably here, but it allows a project to stay on course. And the best way I can describe it, I was trying to think of it last night, is if you think about driving down a highway, you have your guardrails on the side of the road to keep everyone from going off the road and hurting themselves in an accident. The guardrails are really more the controls that project governance put in place. Then you have your lane markers that really kind of allow everyone to know what their roles are and where they play, that what their role plays in the specific project. And then you have your highway signs that are really more the communication side. So it's really it's putting the proper tools in place, and it's putting the structure in place that puts the proper rules, regulations, and controls in place, mitigates the risk as much as possible, clearly defines the roles and responsibilities. And then really the most important is the communication and the documentation throughout the project. How are we going to let all the team members know what's going on, and making that communication consistent and clear and concise throughout the project?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I never heard that. I've heard the guardrail analogy, but never the full highway analogy. With not only the guardrails, but the line markers and the signs and everything. That's a great analogy. And then occasionally you see, like, you're driving down the highway, and you see the skid mark of a car that like ran into the guardrail. The guardrail's all mangled, but you could see that it's still intact. So it kind of reminds you of, like, even human behavior and mistakes and things like that might lead a transformation down off the highway. But if you got that guardrail in place, it might still be a slight accident, but it's a lot less tragic than if you hadn't had the guardrails there. So that's a good analogy there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, good. So I want to say hi to the audience here. A couple people have chimed in on where they're joining from today. Someone on LinkedIn joining from Glasgow, UK, although I can't see the name, so I apologize for that. Alcinda joining from Johannesburg, South Africa. Darian joining from Denver. Thanks for joining. And then Edmund on LinkedIn didn't say where he's from, but he says hello. So hello to you, Edmund. Thanks for being here today. And again, thank you to everyone for joining here today. If you have questions for Nate, we're talking about mastering project governance in digital transformations and ERP implementation. So I'm curious to hear from the audience as I'm asking Nate this next question. I'm curious to hear from the audience, though, if you feel like your project or projects you've been involved with in the past, if you feel like if you've used project governance, or if you've had a good experience or any sort of experience with project governance, I'd love to hear any comments you have around that in the chat here, and we're keeping an eye on that as we go through the questions here. So just diving into that a little bit. So that was a great analogy you just described around the highway, analogy for digital transformation project governance. But what are some of the key elements that you would look for in a strong project governance framework?
Well, I'll jump in on, and I might be repeating myself a little bit from what I just said, but I think it's really, and I'll kind of narrow it down to about 7 different areas, but it's really getting the rules and the regulations and the controls in place, and basically trying to figure out, is the project set up for success, and do we have the right rules in place and the right controls in place, so that when we get through with this project, and as we're implementing the technology or implementing the change management initiative, are we doing it so that we're not only going to support the organization, but that we're not going to, that we're also going to support the organization's adherence to these rules and regulations. And I bring that up in the sense that we have a lot of clients that have ISO compliance issues or compliance requirements, that we have dealing with finance. We have a lot of SEC requirements. So it's really making sure that not only is the project going to adhere to these rules and regulations, but that it supports the overall organization's adherence. And then we talk about risk management and mitigation. Again, kind of making sure that we are doing the best that we can to mitigate our risk. You're never going to eliminate risk, but when we go back to the guardrail analogy, do we have a guardrail in place so that if something does go off the rails, we're going to be able to limit the amount of damage that's done going forward? Then we really get into kind of the heart of the tools that we're putting in place. And that is at the onset of the project, sitting down and really clearly laying out what the roles and responsibilities are. Who's responsible for what is their role in the engagement, everywhere from the executive leadership team all the way down to the day-to-day people that are going to be working on this project as part of their job, or really maybe as a full-time job, what exactly those roles are and how they interact with everyone. Then we talk about where does that play in the overall project plan. So do we have the clearly defined roles, responsibilities, milestones, and deliverables? So do we know who's doing what, when it's going to be done, and who's responsible for getting that done? Then I really think that probably the most important is communication and documentation. And this is really critical. And I think if we look at probably one of the biggest success factors and one of the biggest causes of failure in a project and in an overall in client engagement, it's the lack of controls and the lack of documentation. So it's really sitting down and saying, how are we going to communicate? And when we talk about the communication, we talk about how it has to be the proper communication at the proper time, and adhering to the proper levels. So when we talk about, we work a lot with manufacturing clients. The communication to the manufacturing floor is likely going to be different than the communication to the executive team. The executive team could be traveling. They're going to have about an hour every 2 to 3 weeks to hear these communications and be involved in these status calls. Whereas with the people that are working on the technology on a day-to-day basis are going to need to hear it more constantly. That also is going to change throughout the project. As a project kicks off, we're going to need a lot more communication. As we're going through the day-to-day operations, there's probably going to be a lull where the communication is going to be a lot more 2 to 3 bullet points on here's where we are, here's where we're going. And then towards the end, as we get towards go live, again, that communication is going to ramp up. So it's the proper communication to the proper levels at the proper time.
Yeah, well said. Now, what about just playing devil's advocate for a minute? Is it safe to assume that if I hire a software vendor, or when I hire my software vendor for an ERP implementation, whatever technology I'm deploying, hire the software vendor, they're giving me a project manager. So, and they've got a methodology, each software vendor has their own methodologies that they use, that kind of a branded methodology. What can I just rely on that to serve the function that you're talking about here, serve the purpose that you're talking about with project governance?
Well, I say probably yes and no. There's a real on the fence answer, but I think we do deal. You're exactly right. Everyone's got their different methodologies, their different ways of doing things. I think the real critical point of success is sitting down and making sure those elements are followed. So if they have a really complex project plan, does everyone understand it? And can everyone use that? And can everyone use that as a framework going forward? If it's so complex that only the vendor understands it and the rest of the team doesn't, then we need to adjust that, and we need to put new formats in place that are going to allow everyone to know where we're going, who's doing what, and when we're doing it. Communications is another really important subject. I think it's clear, and on our third stage engagements, we try and come up with a very simple but very detailed communication plan, status report every week, letting everyone know what we've done, what's coming up, who's responsible for it, potential roadblocks, potential challenges going forward, and how this fits into the overall plan. We also track the issues, what issues are outstanding, what issues have been decided, and what decisions have been made. So we, again, I think any tool is probably okay as long as it's fits the situation. If it doesn't, we have to adjust it so that it's useful for not only the vendor, but for the entire team who will be using it throughout the engagement.
Yeah. Yeah. It's well said. And then, usually, one thing I found is that, typically, um, the vendor has, kind of a technical project manager typically. I mean, they're the ones that know the software. They know how to um, guide decisions around the design, build, and testing of the technology. But that's just one work stream within an overall program. And so what you're talking about is really sort of like, really, if we want to be technically accurate here, we would call this program governance and program controls, because you're kind of looking across not just the software vendor work stream, but you're looking across change management, process improvement, and the architecture integration. And if you've got multiple software solutions you're implementing, that makes program governance even more important. So I think that's one way to look at it too. In fact, as we're talking here, I'm just going to drop it in the screen here. Um, and sorry, bear with me. I'm terrible at multitasking. Um, so I'm gonna put up a QR code that talks about the difference between um, gosh, I'm sorry to amuse everyone. I hope this is as amusing as it is to me, but trying to multitask is not my strong suit here.
Give everyone a chance to get a sip of coffee here.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to pop it up here on the screen, up on the top of your screen here. If you just scan the QR code, and we'll drop it in the chat for those that are listening to the audio only version of the podcast. But there's a YouTube video I did. It's a whiteboard video where I describe the difference between project management and program management. I don't talk a lot about project governance and controls in it. I sort of mention it in passing, but it does unpack the difference between project management and then the overall program management. I think really we're talking at more of the program level. All the stuff you're talking about is how do you preserve that or get those controls in place for across all the different work streams in a digital transformation. So check out this video when you get a chance. You can bookmark it or whatever. It's like a 20-minute whiteboard video where I unpack it a little bit more detail. But you can scan the QR code if you want to watch that video after our conversation here. So that's a good overview of sort of, what program management is, what the different components are, why your software vendor isn't necessarily the cure or the silver bullet to give you the program governance. Because a lot of times, when you're working with these software vendors, their heads down, focused on their piece of the puzzle, right? And that's their job. You brought them in to help design, build, and test technology, but that's just one piece of many that goes into this. And so that's where the guardrails come into place. So speaking of methodologies, what are some of the tools, regardless of whether you're talking about, like, for example, SAP has their, I forgot what it's called now. It used to be called the ASAP methodology, but they changed it. And I can't remember. I'm drawing a blank on what it's called now. Microsoft has Sure Step. They all have these different branded methodologies and tool sets and whatnot that all kind of look the same. I mean, they're slightly different flavors, but they cover the basics of deploying technology. Doesn't address the non-technical stuff, but it at least addresses the technology side. But what are some of the methodologies you recommend in general, aside from what the software vendor might bring to the table? What are some of the general methodologies that you recommend for ensuring project controls are effective throughout an implementation?
I think, and this will be a little bit of an on the fence answer, so I apologize in advance, but I think, there's thousands, you mentioned it, there's thousands of methodologies. In fact, I did a search the other day, and I think you can find probably upwards of 4,000 or 5,000 different methodologies. And even if you go to the big four, they all talk about their methodologies and how they're so unique and so different. I think really no matter what you choose, you just need to have the basics in place. And, and I'll go back to, again, the points that we're going to keep making throughout this time that we're together, but it's really making sure that you have the clearly defined roles, clearly defined tasks, milestones, deliverables, reporting structure, communication channels, and really, again, using the right complexity for the organization. So if you're coming into an organization, or if you're an organization that's on this podcast and you have you have 40 employees, so you're a smaller, maybe less than 100 million in business, your methodology is, you don't want to go put in place a methodology that's going to be more adept to a Fortune 500 company. So I think really make sure the complexity matches the challenge, and make sure that you have those those parameters in place. Make sure that everyone knows what they're doing, when they're doing it, why they're doing it, how it fits into the overall organization, and what are the steps needed.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, coming back to your guardrail analogy earlier, this is from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian asks, how can an organization determine if their guardrails are strong enough to handle unexpected issues during a project? And I talked about, when you're driving down the highway, you see the skid marks every so often with a car that clearly hit the guardrail, because then the guardrail's all mangled and twisted or whatever. But how do you ensure that the guardrails are strong enough to ensure that mistakes that humans may make or inevitable issues that come up during any project, how do you ensure that the guardrails are strong enough to address that stuff?
Well, I think it's, I think it really starts off with before you get the project in place, it's really sitting down and looking at what you're trying to do, and then identifying what the risks are at the beginning of an engagement. We always talk about, in fact, I mentioned that I worked at Deloitte, and it was a very pointed effort on any of our engagements that we never talked about eliminating risk. It was always mitigating risk, because you'll never build a strong enough guardrail that an 18-wheeler can't go over it, or there's always something that could get through that guardrail. But it's really sitting down and identifying at the beginning of the engagement what are the potential risks and what are the controls that we can put in place. And then I think what is really a great mitigating factor is just that consistent communication, again, at every different level. So making sure that the team's meeting on a weekly basis, making sure everything is going as planned, or you're identifying what some of the challenges or what some of the risks are that you're facing. And we talk about it all the time in our governance structure that we have in place. Is an issue that's identified within 5 days, within that 1 week time frame of one status report to the other, is going to be very easily handled compared to an issue that's not identified for a month or a month and a half. So again, address the issues and address the risks and the concerns when they happen, versus letting not having the right process or not having the right tools in place, and letting it go on and letting it become a bigger issue or risk.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of that, this kind of comes back to a point you made earlier about communication, and how communication is one of those key elements of project governance. This question is a comment from Alcinda on LinkedIn. Alcinda says, in my experience, establishing a feedback loop of what's working well and what's not from the teams on the ground being impacted by the transformation usually is lacking. And so it sort of crosses over into the whole realm of change management and communications. But what are your thoughts on this? I mean, how do change management and just overall communications, bi-directional communications, how does that factor in, or how should that be baked into what a project governance framework looks like?
I think, again, when we talk about communication and documentation, we talk about, and I think we're going to address this later, but we talk about where we look at overall successes and challenges on the project, and how that can not only be used down the road on an engagement, but can also be bubbled up and used throughout the organization. So what we really try and do on all of our engagements, and again, this is a little bit of one of those, you don't know what you don't know. So organizations that don't know this, or that don't do this, probably don't know exactly what they're missing out on. But what we try and do is we try and talk about, here's the issues that have been solved, and then here's the decisions that have been made, and how did those decisions affect what's going on. So we look at, did this help the engagement? Can we put these decisions in place further on down the road in the engagement to help it go smoother? And then not only that, how does this relate to the entire organization? Is this something that we could put in place for the entire organization that's going to make everyone better? So I think really, just again, back to my point that I'll make 100 times over, communication and documentation and tracking this, and really letting everyone know that, like, we tend to focus so much on the challenges, again, addressing the challenges, but really letting everyone know, here's something that we found that really has made a big difference from a success level, and bubbling it up throughout the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes total sense. And to Alcinda's point, and your point too, Nate, it's easy to forget communications when you get heads down and you get buried in all the details of these projects. And I don't want to say you stick your head in the ground, but you're just so intensely focused on what's right in front of you. It's easy to forget what's going on around you. There's still a business being run. There's still people being impacted by this. And how do you ensure that that communication is happening and that we're picking up on risks and we're picking up on potential warning signs? How does risk management factor into this? By the way, speaking of risk, I just thought of this. How do you ensure that the risk mitigation controls are in place, or that we can proactively identify risks as they start to emerge, rather than waiting until they become such big problems that you can't ignore them anymore?
Well, I think that is a really critical point with risk management is, again, I think that we're at the beginning of an engagement. It's fairly easy to sit down and say, here's the big risk that we're going to face. You either going to know that from what you faced before on technology engagements, or that an organization, for example, like an organization might be really bad at documenting their decisions. So they know that that's a risk that they've had as an organization throughout. So those are really easy at the beginning of an engagement to identify. But it's really, I think the key is, as a risk, it's a little bit easy to overreact and just think everything is a risk and we've got to address it. But I always would say err on the side of identifying and addressing and eliminating risk as soon as they become apparent. So don't just assume, hey, this is a risk. I don't think it's going to be an issue. Let's give it a couple weeks and see what happens. Address it. If it really isn't a concern, document that you addressed it and move on. But again, if you address it now and before it becomes a bigger risk or a bigger issue, you're going to be able to way more effectively mitigate that risk, not only at the time, but in the future within the engagement.
Yeah. Makes sense. What about, one thing that I can't help but think about when we think about project governance or program governance controls, it's not really sexy stuff to talk about. It's not cool to talk about putting controls in place and, how do you provide oversight and controls? It sounds very draconian or top down command and control sort of thing. Very necessary, but I guess the question becomes, in this world of agile and flexibility and being nimble and all that stuff, how do you find that right balance between having governance controls and structure and that sort of thing versus being agile and flexible and sort of rolling with the punches and adapting as things change throughout the project? How do you find that right balance between the two?
Well, and this will make me sound like the ultimate nerd in saying this, but I think the more controls and the more structure you have in place, the more it allows you to be agile, the more it allows you to be creative. I am, along the third stage theme, I'm fascinated with people that are great with the guitar. And I think about like the fact that there's a structure in place as you play the guitar. And the more you learn that structure, the more you don't worry about it anymore, the more you can be creative. And so I think really where we see organizations thrive is when you have a really good governance structure in place, not only on these engagements, but throughout the organization. If you have that in place, it allows people to, it allows your resources and your mind space to be free to be really worrying about how is the technology going to make the organization better. So I'd say it allows you to be free of worrying about what's going on and more worrying about what you're going to be able to do in the future and how it's going to help the organization in the future.
Yeah, it's another great analogy. Play guitar or any instrument. There's structure. There's patterns. Music is all about patterns and yes, a certain amount of repeatability, but obviously there's a huge amount of creativity. So you've got to be able to have the technically sound piece of it to go with the creative side of it. And I think that's a big part of it too. Is I think if you do it right, your program governance can adapt. Obviously, it should be able to adapt to things as they change. If you've got a clear understanding of what it is you're trying to accomplish as an organization, and you've got a clear vision and direction, the governance should reflect that. And it's going to look different for you as an organization than it might with one of your peers based on what it is you're trying to accomplish. Sort of like back to your music analogy, if you're playing rock and roll versus jazz, you're going to have different sorts of governance or patterns or whatever you look for in those sorts of projects. So I think that's a great point. I've never heard anyone say that project governance can actually give you more flexibility. I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. Now, how can organizations, especially, let me back up for a second. We work with a lot of organizations that are larger multinationals, and they have separate sort of PMO departments, or program management office, program managers and things like that. And anytime there's a big project, they put someone from the PMO on the project to sort of provide that governance and control. But how do you ensure that you're not overcomplicating the governance process? In other words, how do we make sure that it's not so top down and bureaucratic and stifling, that it slows down the project? What would you say to that?
I think the best guidance that we have is start out simple. And again, we walk into organizations that are Fortune 500, Fortune 50 organizations. We know that we're not going to be able to manage the project on spreadsheets. But we come into a lot of organizations that are 50, 60 people. We know that probably most of what we can accomplish, we can get by with a simple spreadsheet tool that we can use throughout the engagement. So I would say the best is to sit down and start simple. Start with something that everyone understands, everyone can use. And at the time you find yourself spending more time tracking things manually and spending more time updating your tools than you are using your tools, then it's time to add some complexity. But I think a lot of times organizations tend to get something really complex and they struggle with it and they never really know how to use it completely. So it just becomes more of a headache than it is a tool that can help them. So again, start simple. Track the basic things that we've talked about, track decisions, track status, track the issues that you're facing, put together a simple timeline. Some project plans can be as simple as putting together an Excel spreadsheet. Microsoft Project's always a good starting point, but then there's also organizations that are going to need to have something a lot more complex. But you can always add complexity, but taking complexity away is really a lot harder, and it's really going to muddle the process if you get too complex and too robust of a tool at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. And I will say, I don't know if you agree with this or not. I will say that if there's a more commonly likely error, it's that companies err on the side of not enough governance. I mean, it's not that often that we see companies that are just so robust with their program governance or their project governance or their PMO function. They're so robust that they're overcomplicating. I mean, it does happen occasionally, but more often than not, I think the clients we see at third stage are more likely to not have enough controls in place. Would you agree with that, or have you seen otherwise?
No, and I think you're right, and I think I always talk about when people say, "Oh, we don't want to do that. We don't want to over communicate with our employees," and it's like, well, error on the side, go to the point where you really are over communicating. Everyone has 2 minutes in their day to read an email or to listen to a voicemail or watch a video or whatever. 2 minutes isn't going to throw your organization over the edge as far as making everyone so busy. And so, yeah, you're right. We rarely go into an organization that over governs things, but I think, again, kind of keep going until it becomes an issue. But we rarely see that happen. So you can always add more. And again, I think the more the guardrails and the more the controls are in place, the more you're going to free up time and free up headspace for everyone to really focus on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Yeah. One dynamic we see with our clients too, fairly commonly as it relates to software vendors and system integrators, the more technically focused people on the project is they tend to be the ones that say, hey, let's not worry about this program governance stuff, because back to your guitar analogy, we just want to play music. We don't need to deal with all this structure and these controls and stuff like that. Let us just go build and design and build the technology. Let's get out there and test it. And let's not worry about all these controls. So I think, most organizations we work with feel pressure from their software vendor and their technical implementer, the system integrator, to have less controls in place. Because if you think about it, that allows them to just go deploy technology, and so much of program governance or effective program governance is not just focused on making sure the technology works. That's actually the easy part of these projects. It's more making sure that you've got alignment internally and that your processes fit with the technology and the other way around, to make sure that people are adapting to the change well along the way. All that stuff. And if you don't have the right governance and controls in place, that's the stuff that suffers. It's usually not the software design and build that struggles, although it could struggle too as a result of that.
Yeah.
But what do you see as some of the signs of poor program governance? So, in other words, rather than, obviously, if a project completely fails miserably, you could probably look back and say, okay, you didn't have the right governance and controls in place. But what are some of the signs along the way as you're going through an implementation or a project like this? What are some of the warning signs you look for that says, hey, you probably don't have the right guardrails in place on this project?
Well, I think you could, and I'll probably narrow it down to 4 or 5, but I think really one of the biggest indications is people are spending a lot of time trying to figure out what decisions have been made and why they are where they are. If you have a really well documented communication channel and a good tracking channel for what are our issues, how did we resolve those issues, what are the decisions that have been made, and what are the upcoming tasks as a result of those, that then you're going to spend a lot less time trying to recount the past. So I think when we walk into organizations and we can ask them, like, where are your issue trackers? Where are the decisions? Have the decisions been made? If they're really quickly able to answer that question and show us that, then we know that that's probably not the issue. I think the second is communication, and that is really knowing, at a very, very simple level, where are we going, and what are the upcoming potential challenges that we are going to face. That being said, also within that communication, we have to have a really clear understanding of who's doing what. So when we walk into organizations, probably every one of the engagements that we come in that's had some sort of failure or some sort of timeline or budget issue, it's because decisions are being made by the people that shouldn't be making those decisions. So IT is making decisions for the finance department, or finance is making decisions for the entire organization, and not really incorporating and not truly incorporating who is responsible to make those decisions and who needs to be making them. So it's kind of summed up in making sure the right people are making the right decisions and are doing the right things within the project, and making sure that's really clear throughout the organization.
Yeah, that's a great point, because so much of project governance isn't just the tools, like the issue tracker and the risk logs and things. Some of the things that you've alluded to. It's not just that. It's also ensuring that there's clarity around how we make decisions, and it's a great point. And I had a professor on this podcast before. He's a professor out of it's either Amsterdam or Brussels. I think he's based out of Amsterdam. I'm sorry, his university's in Brussels, but I think he lives in Amsterdam. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He's in Europe. His name's Hans Moldner, and he's been on this podcast before. And he talks about how he's done a ton of research of, like, I think it's over 100,000 ERP implementations, and he studied these 100,000 implementations and looked at the data, and he found that the number one cause of delays and budget overruns is what he calls decision latency. And it's, in other words, it's how fast can an organization make a decision. And so often we get into these projects where no one really knows how to make the decision. For example, you've got this software that has off-the-shelf functionality, pre-configured functionality, whatever, and it doesn't match perfectly with the way you want it to work. Surprise, surprise. That happens a lot. Like in any project, that's going to happen. So then the question is, well, what do we do? Do we change our processes to fit the software? Do we customize the software to fit the processes? Do we go find a third-party bolt-on to address that gap in the software functionality? And suddenly, these teams they start spinning in circles trying to make decisions, and they don't know, like, what's the right answer. And so much of that depends on what you're trying to accomplish as an organization. What are the goals, and what are the strategic imperatives of what it is, that this project is supposed to accomplish for the organization. And if you don't have that clarity, I feel like that clarity strategically is really the foundation for project governance, because your project governance has to reflect the strategy, the goals, the overall direction. Those are the guardrails, right? The guardrails you're talking about earlier is that this is the direction we're going as an organization, and here's how we make decisions, and we've got a business case to support it and all that stuff. Is that what you've seen, or how do you factor in that strategic alignment with project governance?
No, I think that's great. And in fact, as you were saying that, I was thinking about what we try to put into our status reports. And this was a result of a client that we had when I first joined Third Stage, really kind of elaborated on that whole decision documentation. And this organization was really clear as far as what decision did we make? We set the software up to do X, Y, and Z. Why did we make that decision? And what are potential changes in the future that might make us change that decision? And I think when you really look at those three elements and you break it down that simplistically, or make it that simplistic, then it really allows you in the future to come back and say, oh, you know what? Right now we set the software up to do this and this, and it's really not helping us. Let's go back and figure out why we set it up that way. And then you find out, oh, we did it because we were taking all of our orders online, and now we're taking them by phone and online. So that decision needs to change, and we're going to document this decision going forward. So I think it's, you could get way in the weeds and try to overanalyze a decision, and you're just going to have paralysis by analysis. Or you can sit down and say, here's the decision, here's why we made it, here's what could change in the future, and let's move on. And then if you have that clearly documented, it's a lot easier to come back and address it when you run into a new issue going forward.
Yeah. And it also puts it takes some of the pressure off the project team, the project sponsor, and it puts it back on the executives. Because really, the executives aren't responsible for executing the project and mitigating all the risks and all that sort of stuff. Obviously, they've got to delegate a lot of that to the project team, but the executive team has to have that clarity and that ability to articulate how this project fits into the overall strategy. And by the way, how are decisions going to be made, and what are the expectations around how decisions are made? What goals are we trying to accomplish as we make some of these various trade-offs and tough decisions that are never perfect? You've got to make these trade-offs or these decisions that oftentimes are the lesser of two evils. But if you have clarity around how to make those decisions and what goals you're trying to accomplish starting at the top of the organization, that makes things a lot more clear. But what ends up happening is so many organizations just think, well, this is just an ERP upgrade, so we're just going to let the project team have at it and go upgrade the technology. How hard can it be? But obviously, there's a lot of details that go into that. In fact, I'm going to put up another QR code right here, and this is our phase 0 checklist. And this stuff we're talking about here is really stuff that you should put in place before you start the implementation. Now, it's better late than never, but if you're early in a digital transformation or an ERP project, now is the time to put this stuff in place. And this phase 0 checklist covers way beyond what we're talking about here today. It's not just project governance and controls. It's also talking about business process definition and change strategies and stuff that you should make sure you have in place before you really start getting into the meat of the implementation. So scan this QR code right here. I'll drop it in the link for this podcast episode as well in the show notes. But if you want to check out that list, you can get that off our website there. But while I leave that up there, I want to come back to another question here that was a really good one, sort of related to what we were just talking about, Nate, around making these decisions and these trade-offs. But this is from Zenon. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. Zenon on LinkedIn says, in your program governance system, how do you align requirements with clients as well as disparate sales and delivery teams? Which I think is a good question, because you get these technology providers that come in and sell you a vision or sell you the technology, but how do you ensure that the client requirements, what the technology can do, what the sales people have said they could do, and the delivery teams, how do you ensure, in program governance that all this stuff is addressed and aligned?
Yeah, and I think it really starts off, and this overlaps a little bit with change management, but I think it really starts off what I alluded to earlier is that before the project even kicks off, it's sitting down and saying, where are we now? Where do we want to be? And how will this technology or this initiative get us to where we want to be. And so to sit down and say, okay, we're this organization, we want to be a $500 million organization in the future. This technology is going to allow us to expand our sales, and then really going through and making sure that what we need the technology to do is what's been promised from the vendor or whatever the source may be, and really making sure that they can actually do what we need it to do, and that it can do what they've promised. So those are, and I break those down because first of all, can it do what they told us it can do? A lot of times that answer might be less than 100. It might be 90%. And then not only that, but if it does what they tell us it can do, is it going to help us get to where we want to be? Or are we going to put a system in place and we're still going to be manually tracking orders because the system never was able to track the orders how we wanted it, or whatever that might be? So where we are, where we want to be, what the technology can do, and if it can do what it says it can do, is that what we need to get to where we need to be in the future?
Yeah. Yeah. Here's an interesting comment from Ed on YouTube. Ed says, maybe the concern is the fear of the business taking a decision that cannot be understood and the implications to the project cost or timing impact. This feedback is a job from the vendor or consultant. And I want to talk about this just for a second, or get your take on this, Nate, because this is a really interesting point and actually there's another follow-up question from another audience member on LinkedIn I want to get to here in just a second. In fact, let me pull this up too, and I'll sort of sum it all up into a more concise question here, but I think these are really related, good questions. So that's Ed's question. Maybe the fear of the business making a decision and you can't understand the implications on the project cost or the timing, and you need your outside vendor or consultant to help you understand that. That's part one. Part two comes from Alcinda on LinkedIn. Alcinda says, if we're saying that clients don't know what we don't know, who defines when a project is complete? And is that done up front or at the end of a project? Basically, how do we ensure that we don't have moving targets? Now, I want to kind of roll this all into one theme, which is a client, even if a client has a real robust PMO function, a program management office function within the organization. Most organizations don't, but even if they do, they're not experts in ERP implementations. They probably haven't done a lot of these projects because most organizations only do this once every 10 or 20 or 30 years. So they're not going to be experts in-house to do this. So they do rely on their outside consultants or their vendors. However, oftentimes, more often than not, vendors are focused on, is the technology working? Does it work? Are the bugs worked out? Do the workflows work? That's fine. We need to do that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the organization is ready and that the organization has adapted the technology and that the processes and the technologies are all aligned and roles and responsibilities are all well defined. You could have perfectly designed and deployed technology, but still have a complete disaster, complete failure in the implementation, not because the vendor didn't do their job, but because there's all the other non-technical stuff that didn't happen. So what do you do when you've got a software vendor whispering in your ear that, hey, everything's fine, the technology works, let's just hit the button and go live? We're not experts in ERP implementations because we're not, we have a business to run day to day. How do you reconcile that? Like, what are some of the ways that we, for example, third stage can, have provided that stopgap, or what are some of the ways that organizations can overcome that?
Well, and we've run into this quite a few times, and I think really a big chunk of mitigating this risk, or mitigating getting into that position in the first place, is taking a step back and saying, where is this overall project fit into the organization? When we go back to that executive visioning, where are we going to be, and how's this technology going to help? But it's really rare, if almost, I don't think we ever see it, that organizations are going through a lot more than just this technology implementation. We have one client that I think is probably implementing, alongside of what we're working on, they're implementing 10 to 15 more technology solutions within the organization. There's going to be change management. There's going to be organizational changes throughout the engagement. So it's really stepping back before you come to that point where you hit the button and go live and say, okay, now we've promised what we delivered. Everything's going to be fine. We're good. And it's really stepping back and saying, where does this fit into the overall picture? And if we get to that milestone, is this in alignment with the rest of the organization? So are we, not only are we supporting what the organization wants to do, but are we looking at ourselves and relation to all the other initiatives that are going on within the organization, and is it all moving towards the right direction? And that's not I think, Eric, you could probably elaborate on this, but that's a really tough one, because everyone's working in their bubble, and at the executive level, there's probably a pretty clear understanding of where everything fits together. But beyond that, everyone kind of has their day-to-day job, and they have their responsibilities. And when you add that to a technology implementation, it becomes even more siloed. So it's really taking that step back and saying, how are we going to interact with all the other engagements, and how does this support the overall vision as part of the overall organization?
Right. Yeah. And how do you make sure that you're kind of coming back to what we were talking about just a few minutes ago? We were talking about the whole concept of decision making and making sure you've got internal alignment. How do you ensure that all stakeholders are aligned on the governance protocols and the project methodologies from the outset? How do you define these, especially if you're an organization that's not used to these big, large, complex projects, you don't have your own internal PMO department or function. How do you get that alignment to make sure you've got the right governance in place for your transformation?
Well, I think it really starts with the executive sponsorship, and it's really sitting down and making sure that everyone knows that this is part of an overall organizational initiative. So if you have poor executive sponsorship at the beginning, I think when we talk about what we see from a third stage point of view, that's usually where projects have the best chance of going off the rail. If there's not that overall buy-in from the executive team, and there's not a clear understanding of just exactly what this means to the organization, and that it's a key part of the organization, and what everyone's role is within the initiative, and how that plays within the organization. If you don't have that clear understanding and that clear sponsorship and ownership by the executive team, you're really setting yourself up for a lot of challenges in the future.
Right. Looks like we've got a guest appearance here, a second guest on the show here today.
Snow day for Denver Public Schools.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. That's is it completely closed today, or is it a late start?
2-hour late start. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Just enough to be on the podcast.
Yeah. It's freezing cold in Colorado right now, so a lot of schools have late starts here today, but thankfully it's going to warm up here today. So what about, so companies are about to start their new digital transformation. They're early on, or they're in the early stages of planning for a project. Maybe they've already gotten started on the project. What advice would you give to companies that are just starting to figure out, or trying to figure out, how to get the right governance and control frameworks in place? What sort of starting advice could you leave us with here today?
I would say start simple, and what we try and do is really hit those elements of putting the right tools in place, and making sure everyone knows what the tools are, how to use the tools, and why we're using the tools. So sitting down and meeting with the different groups, and coming up to an agreement, or coming up with an agreement on what the communication plan is going to be. Are we going to have live communication? Is it going to be a conference call? Is it going to be a video? How often that occurs, and exactly what the structure of that communication is going to look like. And then really sitting down and just putting the tools in place, putting down the status report tools, putting down a project plan that everyone knows exactly how to use and what it means to them, and putting in a tool and a methodology to track your issues and your decisions. And again, start simple. Don't let the complexity of all these different tools slow you down. Really sit down, and if it has to start with an Excel spreadsheet, or if it has to be done manually, just get it in place and build on it as you go forward. But getting that framework in place is critical at the beginning, because that is going to give everyone, again, the guardrails and the lane markers going forward, so everyone knows exactly what their role is in the project, and putting the controls in place and the communication in place, so everyone knows where we're going and how we're going to get there.
Yeah, great advice. And another piece of advice I'll leave you with, in addition to what Nate just said, is download this Phase Zero checklist right here. It'll get you started on some of the things you should think about. as you're planning for your implementation, including project governance and controls, but also covers things around change management and understanding your business processes, your data, your current system landscape, all that stuff. So check this out right here, Phase Zero checklist. You can get it off our website. Just scan that QR code, and we'll drop it in the chat as well, or in the show notes as well. But I want to thank you for being here, Nate. Great conversation. It flew by, and I know there's a lot more we could cover, and maybe we'll do a part 2 here on project governance at a future time. But really appreciate you being here today.
Great. Thanks for having me. And if anyone has any questions on anything we've discussed, or if you'd like to talk about any of the project governance methodologies or tools that we have created here at Third Stage, please reach out to me. Be happy to talk to you about it.
Yeah, we'll tag you at least on LinkedIn. We'll tag you on there, so you can get in touch with Nate, connect with him there. He's a great thought leader in the space. So appreciate having you here today. I appreciate the audience being here today. Thanks for all the great questions. Again, this episode will be featured this interview will be featured on an upcoming episode of Transformation Ground Control that'll get released in 2 weeks from tomorrow, I believe it is. So keep an eye out for that. We'll edit this, add some more content, and it'll be formally released as part of that podcast series. And thank you for being part of the live production here today for the audience. That's why we do this live, so we can get all the great engagement and then make it part of the podcast going forward. So thanks for being here. We do these live discussions every Tuesday, same time, same place. So be sure to check out our upcoming schedule, and hope to see you next week as well. Have a great week in the meantime.